Welcome to Linda's TV show. If it is your first time of stopping by or coming across my YouTube channel, you are highly welcome. Please, I beg you for this favor, click on that red button that says subscribe. Beside the red button is a notification bell. Turn the bell on so that anytime I upload a new video, you will be the first person to check it out. I appreciate each and every one of you who always come back to watch my videos. Like you know, I present news on daily basis to you. So after watching the video, you are free to criticize and leave your comment constructively. Share the video. Yeah, you can share it to your family, friends, anybody that you can, so that
description of the type of crisis that we've been through before. We've been through the crisis in which there was open civil war spreading across borders from Liberia into Sierra Leone. Then we saw it come to Cote d'Ivoire, and in the neighborhood, Guinea was under threat. But we knew exactly that rebel groups had the objective of marching into the capital and capturing political power. And to that extent, you knew the actors, you knew the level of damage and destruction, and so you could comprehend your response in terms of working with those actors in different ways. But we thought we had overcome that, and we had gone now into a period of stability. The reason why the crisis we are confronted with now is unprecedented is because there is the culmination of triple, if you would call it, crisis. You have terrorism that continues to spread to the extent that some of the capital cities of the Sahelian countries like Ouagadougou and Bamako were only kilometers away in 2022 from being overtaken or overrun by some of the terrorist organizations. Then the direct consequence of all this, as a result of bad governance, for example, the rigging of legislative elections in Mali, the change in presidential term limits to benefit the incumbent president who had sworn an oath before taking office to respect the Constitution, and now changing that same Constitution to be in office for a third term. The type of unbridled corruption in which the capture of the state and its institutions benefited or benefits those who occupy political power. All this cumulatively, now with the impact of climate change, in which intercommunal conflicts have increased, particularly between those who are farming and those who are herders, and now makes a governance crisis so difficult for even elected leaders to be able to govern. And what you then see is, you put all that together, and what does it tell us? Our capacity to respond is using old tools, is using outdated instruments. We are still relying on the 1999 protocol on peacekeeping, peace and security, which basically is a reactive, if you call it, sanctions regime. And we have done much less, or we've done little to promote the type of good governance, to bring about the type of creativity, and to tackle the leadership crisis. And so if you put this together, we are like groping in the dark and trying to find our way out. And regrettably, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and now Niger only remind us that that contagion is not ending with Niger. If our response continues to be this old attitude, then we should not imagine that we are ending the crisis we are seeing in West Africa with Niger, that political instability and destabilization will continue. And if that were to happen, what you have aptly described, our economy is still going to go downhill. But I want to end on this note. for me, the tragedy is, if you look at Asia, they are moving forward. They are progressing. They are taking people in their millions out of poverty. People often talk about China, but people do not talk much about Indonesia. People don't talk about Malaysia, even Thailand. Asia is moving on. We know already that the metropolis of former colonial Europe continues in one way or the other to manage their affairs. For me, the tragedy is, if I refer to the Sustainable Development Goals, that has the mantra that no one should be left behind. We as African people are being left behind. But it's in our hand to turn around our fortune. Regardless of what is happening that impacts upon us negatively, decisions that are made that we are not even there to participate, we cannot run away from the fact that it's in our hand to change the fortunes of our people.
So we are all talking about terrorism in the region. What is the terrorist architecture in the region? Who and who are involved in the promotion and actualization, of the terrorist enterprise in the region?
The quick background to that is to appreciate in the first place, how did this evolve? And one thing that people do not seriously take into account is when they refuse to read the text. If you recall, contrary to good advice and sound advice, the coming together of NATO member states to bomb Libya and to end the Gaddafi regime unleashed an unimaginable, in my view, level of instability that we have not talked about enough. For the simple reason that Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was somebody who, in very interesting ways, was an intermediary that kept the balance in Northern Africa, particularly in areas such as in Mali, even in Niger also, where the conflicts between the Tuareg rebel groups and central governments were constantly active. So that was one aspect. But the other aspect was, because the war started and Colonel Gaddafi was fighting very hard, he deployed support from some of these Tuareg rebels on his side. Now, what happened? When he was forcefully removed and tragically as it ended, these Tuareg rebel groups simply descended back into the Sahara and into the Sahel. The immediate configuration was to go back to the unaddressed grievances since the independence of Mali, to get those grievances addressed with the authority in Bamako. And keep in mind that Mali's biggest challenge has been the building of the nation state. Because it's like two states that have existed and have never been able to come to a common agreement of building the unity of the states. The Tuaregs in the north, then the rest of Mali in the south. Now, unknown to these Tuareg rebels, their capacity to sustain the war with the authority in Bamako will be infiltrated by jihadist groups who have formed at that time, taking advantage of how ISIS was implanted in the Gulf states and in the Middle East. And so with that affiliation and the type of networks, you then had the different jihadist groups springing up and networking across the region. But one must place at the center of this argument that in international politics, we often do not want to treat the level of deep emotional resentment to be a motivator and a driving factor of conflict. I saw this then, and it's still pervasive. That for the terrorist groups, they were first of all radicalized, and then they sought to spread extremism. And where did that come from? It came from their understanding of, whether it is perceived or real, of the type of injustice that you could not do anything about. And there is a long link from the invasion of Iraq and the demise of Saddam Hussein, then Muammar Gaddafi. And so you had groups that were willing to say, then we will create havoc in this world and let's all go along with it. And in one way or the other, the interpretations could be different depending on where you are. This provided the fervor, the reason for the type of organization that guided these terrorist groups. Of course, some of them would articulate ideologies related to their own understanding of the purity of Islam for those who are jihadis. But they only emerged second to the deep resentment of how they saw the injustice of the world. And that is why we've not been able to address this problem. Those who, if you call it, meted out so much violence and rage have never even taken accountability of their actions. They saw it only in terms of war, and that civilians who were massacred, it was only the collateral damage of war. And I think that it is something that if we still do not address, we cannot fully comprehend how we end terrorism.
This drift from Libya southwards into the Sahara, so is it in any way connected with the Azawad rebellion?
Yes.
And what is the Azawad rebellion anyway?
So the Azawad rebellion, which now in its formation is around what we call the Coordination of the Movement of Azawad, CMA, is basically the constellation of different groups of people who originally were in the movement of the independence of the Tuaregs in the north of Mali. But they were willing to negotiate to the extent possible that the issues of inclusion, the issues of the distribution of resources, and how then they felt that they belonged to the Republic of Mali, that if all those things were taken into account, they were willing to stop the war, and they were willing to actually actively contribute as citizens of Mali. And if you were to fast track it, this becomes the basis of the 2015 Algiers Agreement, in which Algeria was the mediator between the government of Bamako and the Tuareg groups. Now, the challenge is the infiltration into Azawad by violent extremist groups that Azawad could not deal with, because they first came with the type of political ideology that suggested that they supported the social justice issues that the Coordination of the Movement of Azawad was fighting for. But then once they infiltrated and they could mobilize and recruit, they then splintered off on their own more violent and extreme, if you call it, jihadist ideology that was less political. So if I were to summarize it, Azawad is a political movement that is seeking to have inclusion in Mali, to have social justice. In fact, the 2015 Algiers Agreement agreed on how the distribution of resources will give priority to northern Mali that has never benefited from the resources of the Republic of Mali. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about resources, there is also the analysis that suggests that there are resources that exist and have not yet been exploited. And so Azawad is also looking at, for example, oil resources that they will benefit from, and for that matter, they need a political agreement in which they can have access to those resources for their communities. And they needed to negotiate with Bamako for the fair distribution of these resources. But that's not true of those who then infiltrated Azawad more as jihadist terrorist groups for the purposes of taking power where they can and trying now to promote their own jihadist ideology.
How is Azawad or the movement, related in any way to Boko Haram to start with, to what has been described as the low-intensity civil war in the Niger Delta, and also perhaps the secessionist movement in the eastern part of Nigeria?
The common thread along all this is the sense of injustice. Keep in mind that the original founder of Boko Haram was somebody who you would have described as he was an Islamic preacher who was concerned about the vulnerable and who was a humanitarian and who went into communities but had the capacity to link the theology of Islam to the well-being of people. And sooner than later, he started to draw massive crowds, and he started through the different mosques to offer social support and to be attentive to the vulnerable, widows, orphans, children who were abandoned, and to try and challenge the type of Islamic acceptance of depending on the benevolence of wealthy people, in which the wealthy people feel good about their humanitarian benevolence, and yet all that is written by the social injustice that in the first place put people in desperate need. So his activities then became a threat to establish political actors, and so they ambushed him in one of his social support work, and he was killed, which would now be the reason for the resentment and for the rise of the Boko Haram that turned very violent and was no longer interested in any form of support to anybody but to fight the established order, but on the basis of extremism, on the basis of an ideology that's driven by the sense of injustice. And you look at Niger Delta, and it was as it continues to pertain that you have all these oil resources, but what the oil resources have actually done is to impoverish more the communities, not to mention how it is destroying their environment, that they cannot even have access to clean sources of water. And yet all the resources that is taken away from these communities is building the metropolis and the skyscrapers of cities in Port Harcourt, in Abuja. And so they were driven also by this sense of injustice. And so in each of these you see a common thread. But as I mentioned earlier, rather than responding at the level of the need that has the people at the center, in which people are at the center of our capacity to respond, we thought that by investing in a very powerful military, we could subdue them. But how do you subdue groups that are not logically and rationally looking at their activities on the same level of how political analysis is looking at it? Because in the first place, they have nothing to lose. And that's why for many of them, they will blow themselves up, because they knew that they were in for a struggle that included giving up their lives. And so one mistake was the absence of the channels of the type of dialogue that can be engaging and that can be inclusive. Even if later on there were attempts to try this, but it was rather more of the capacity to go in. In fact, the word that is used these days, which comes from French, neutraliser, is to neutralize. And so when you go in there and you kill the terrorists, you have neutralized them. But for me, it is like you are helping to spread the virus, because each time you hit, you might destroy the number that you have hit, but that does not mean there have not been splinters and little bits that have spread, and each of them grows.
We actually kill human beings and do not kill the ideology.
You don't kill you kill the human beings, but you do not kill the ideology. And this conversation is the type of conversation in which people needed to understand that you respond to the ideology by meeting people at the level of their needs. And that is why the threat, as we described it in the beginning, continues to be volatile, because in each of our countries, the majority of the population are the young people who are less than 30 years. They have become so frustrated that when we sit down and do all the political analysis about democracy, it means nothing to them. Because what they understand is we queue, we elect leaders, and we actually become poorer. But we see the leaders upscale their comfort levels, their capacity to live in luxury, not just themselves, but very close people themselves. And so the question then is, what is all this? And that is why we must understand why the young people are coming up in their numbers anytime there's a coup d'etat. Because they are looking for something, and they are looking for hope. And I'm not necessarily saying that these coup leaders have the answer, but at least in temporary measures, they are able to mobilize these young people on the narrative of our self-worth and our dignity. And as you can see, the common thread in the four countries in which we have military leaders at the moment is to confront the narrative of the past. That is the narrative of exploitation, extortion, in which our resources do not benefit us, and that we are going to change that, including, of course, the type of colonial laws that facilitate the exploitation, and that confront the type of leadership that is compromising with the neo-colonialist, if you call it, partnerships that continue to be dominant in the exploitation. And that is why, if we do not address this substantially, we will continue to see the unraveling from one country to the other.
Now, the secessionist movement in the eastern part of Nigeria, I mean, the resurgence of the dream of Biafra, must also follow the same trajectory, doesn't it?
And at one point, you saw that there was a build-up of momentum. And the fear also was that across the border, you also had the Anglophone secessionist groups. What would happen if you have a linkage? And to that extent, people were eager to see how the response through good governance would deal with that. I thought that when Nigeria went into full-scale political campaigning, the flag bearer of the Labour Party, Peter Obi, had a role in the way his messaging was about how we can get our demands, but through processes that are more democratic. The arrest of the leader of the secessionist groups, in the way it happened, and the way former President Buhari tried to completely delink him from his followers, might have something to do with a certain level of de-escalation. What I see happening is, it will now depend on the politics that President Tinubu would bring into the Niger Delta, because the people of Eastern Nigeria are looking at the Niger Delta and interpreting exactly what it means for us not to have access to our own resources, and linking that also to a very progressive liberation struggle that happens in the Biafran era, and trying to make a good interpretation of that we probably would have been better off if Biafra had succeeded and if secession had succeeded. And so there is a lot of dynamics there that we will see in the next 1 year to 2 years happening, depending on the response capacity of the new political dispensation in Nigeria.
Now we're talking about Nigeria, which has an estimated population of about 230 million.
Yeah.
That's half the population of the whole sub-region.
Yeah.
If Nigeria is in turmoil, how does Nigeria play a role, significant role, in resolving the crisis, especially given the fact that Tinubu, the Nigerian president, is also chair of ECWOS?
Yes, I think this is a very deep and intricate question. But first of all, the size of Nigeria in terms of population will simply overwhelm the rest of the region if things were to escalate to proportions that are not manageable. And that is why, on one hand, you want to be able to assuage that with the level of delivery of social services and good governance that makes people, even in their day-to-day struggles, to feel that there is something people should want to live for. But as you know, we have had a situation in West Africa where in the authority of heads of state, we have kind of rotated leadership from the Anglophone to the Francophone and to the Anglophone. But there was a lot of argument and logical argument, I must say, that you cannot be teaching the Lusophones by simply keeping them out because they are small states. And so then the argument was that Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau are not Francophone or Anglophone, and they also need to take up leadership. And so when Ghana was handing over the chairmanship of ECOWAS, it went to Guinea-Bissau. Now, what happened in Guinea-Bissau? There is an analysis that Guinea-Bissau was completely and totally under the influence of Senegal, and that on their own they could not actually provide that leadership. Not because they are a small state, but because, as you mentioned earlier, because of the dip in West African economies following the pandemic, countries like Guinea-Bissau were even worse affected. In fact, in an interview that the president of Guinea-Bissau gave to an African television channel, he talked about how when he came into office, immediate impress expenses of about 50,000 euro were not even available. And he had to depend on the goodwill of the president of Senegal, not just for support, but for him to also articulate and be part of the advocacy for Guinea-Bissau to begin to restructure its economy. Now that tells you the depth of the deep, impossible situation Guinea-Bissau found itself, and yet had to be the chair of the authority of ECOWAS, which includes convening summits, and these summits, when you convene them, you pay for them. And so when it was now time for it to come out of the Lusophone and to go back to the Anglophone, people felt that it couldn't come back to Ghana. Sierra Leone had just been on the brink of an election that in itself has lots of questions, including violence, where the police was shooting into the headquarters of the opposition party, completely needless, and loss of life. And there are still issues about an electoral commission that is seen not to have executed its roles and functions transparently. And I want us to always rely on our own sources and not necessarily reports that were written from the outside. So it could not have gone to Sierra Leone. And probably Gambia was not under consideration. And so for very good reasons. And at the time that we are with Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, it gave good reason for Nigeria to be chair of ECOWAS. Though, for those who were in that room, President Tinubu himself was a little bit surprised, because he felt, I've just come in, and your first summit is when you introduce yourself, and then you make a statement about, but it's like, okay, we'll take it. And now this is where we find ourselves. I think that President Tinubu will try to exert the type of leadership that is required. But the mistake would be if Nigeria tries to go it alone. And I say this because when we were dealing with civil wars frontally, as I've explained, you knew who you were fighting because it was literally a guerrilla warfare. And your argument was on the sound principles of regional stability, and that your peace and security depended also on my peace and security. And so there was a legitimate reason to have ECOMOG, even if we do not agree with the operational rules. But in the current context, it's much, much more complicated. You need more persuasion, because it's like you are mediating with yourself. Because the institution of the state, from one country to the other, one critical component or one critical institution is the armed forces. So if the armed forces is rebelling against the legitimate governments that have been elected by the people, and for which people are frustrated for many reasons, some of which we have been talking about, and they then decide to take power, how you deal with them will be completely different from when you were dealing with civil wars. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of the challenge, and if I may say so, when we were chair of ECWOS, there was an absence of Nigeria. Now that Nigeria is chair of ECWOS, can there be the presence of Ghana and the others? I don't also want to sound a bit cynical, but as you can see, one inconvenient conversation that we must have in the region is that why are the Francophone countries the worst off? I'm not necessarily saying that those of us in the Anglophone part of West Africa are better.
Thank you so much, my wonderful viewers, for watching this video together with me from the beginning to the end. Like I said before, if you like what you see here, if you like what I do in this platform, as you have finished watching this video, please hit that red button that says subscribe and put on your notification bell to all notification. In that way, you'll be able to know when I upload a new video. Share my videos, leave your comments in the comment section constructively. Until I meet your way again in my next video, I still remain your Linda's TV show. Bye-bye.